and welcome back to the news with Church of Entropy. Thank you so much for the audience who's already tuned in. Really appreciate the questions that have already been asked. I've got some pre-recorded material here, but I can answer some of the questions that are already showing up in the chat here real quick. Is consciousness a fluid? It's being asked by Kelly is Nice. Consciousness is more complex than just a fluid, although some parts of it can be described with fluid mechanics. What I'm going to do is share a link to some slideshows that could be accessed at your leisure on School of Entropy. And you can have a look at the model for consciousness and how it all works together. It's essentially a fountain consciousness. All right, let's have a listen to the news. Please post your questions in the chat, and we'll be getting to that real quick, as well as a summary of the complete shit show of a debate between two atheists about morality and ethics, which went about as bad as anybody could have predicted, between Molly Means and JF Gary P. Hope you all enjoy what I've got prepared for you today. All right, have to pull that up. Whoops. Still getting used to working with my multi-screen here. Here you go, folks. Enjoy. If anyone during these trying times is fit to oversee dealing with such a crisis. Probably not the UN. Subject of yet another controversy. Breitbart News has covered the fact that allegations of sexual abuse have doubled in but a year. Allegations of sexual abuse and exploitation in UN peacekeeping and political missions rose significantly in 2019, with allegations against civilian personnel nearly doubling, a UN report said on Friday. Probably going to be too busy covering up for that to really focus too much on the distracting side issue of alleged worldwide pandemic, collapsing markets, as well as people unable to go to work. More than half the 2019 allegations, of which there were 41, were related to UN peacekeeping mission in Central African Republic, while 15 involved in the mission in Congo, the report said. The Joint African Union United Nations peacekeeping force in Darfur, the UN force in Lebanon, and the former peacekeeping missions in Liberia and Haiti accounted for 3/4 of the remaining 24 cases. Moving right along, how else are people looking to approach this situation, and who is really equipped to lead us through this difficult time? Probably not the elites, who are reportedly fleeing to their bunkers, proving once again they give exactly zero shits about the peons they preside over and are willing to run for cover at the first sign of a problem because they really don't care about anyone but themselves. Can have a look at a screenshot here of what is surely a very beautiful bunker. The number of people infected tops 127,000 worldwide. People are prepping for the worst, which for most people means stocking up on toilet paper and hand sanitizer. But for the uber wealthy, preparation for end of days takes on an entirely different meaning. Recent report in The Guardian noted that wealthy travelers are opting out of commercial airlines, choosing to use exclusive private jets. Private travel precludes crowded terminals as well as the incubator conditions on airliners, but the jet set is taking their pandemic concerns one step further. The Guardian article claimed that people who can afford to do so are fleeing to remote locations. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, do not look to the elites for guidance. They have run at the first sign of trouble. We also have an article talking about Nigel Farage, who has used the opportunity to push his position, suggesting in the typical passive-aggressive Anglo fashion that the West's relationship with China might need to be rethought. Well, Nigel, that would be the understatement of the century. The West appears to be facing its worst crisis since 1939 because of a new global pandemic. Writes Nigel Farage for Newsweek. I believe the attention should now turn to China. when President Trump has talked about the Chinese virus. Others have called it the Wuhan virus. He has been met with waves of criticism and accusations of racism. In the House of Commons, the shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry even said to Trump, now he's calling it the foreign virus, blaming it on Europe for its spread, and today blaming China. I hate to break it to Mrs. Thornberry, but Trump is right. And it is time we all challenged China. Well, I would say harsh words, but I don't really think it quite reaches the status of harsh words, perhaps slightly bothered words. From ReviewJournal.com, 4 senators sold stock before steep market losses from the virus. U.S. senators are not going to save you either. They are just going to cut and run as quickly as a disaster has come in. These people have pulled out of the stock market. They now stand accused of massive stock sell-offs in light of insider knowledge about the virus outbreak of 2020. Instead of doing their jobs and making difficult decisions with the citizens' long-term prosperity in mind, they cut and run at the first sign of a problem, like rats on a sinking ship, proving once again that corporate-style governance always leads to spit-shine turd politicians who have never done an honest day's work in their life and got into the business for their own financial self-aggrandizement. I highly doubt these people will have time to focus on actual solutions for the coronavirus if they are too busy being indicted for what appears to be insider trading. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Richard Burr sold as much as $1.7 million in stocks. Where did he get so much money? Just before the market dropped in February, amid fears about the coronavirus epidemic. Senate records show that Burr and his wife sold between roughly 600,000 and 1.7 million in more than 30 separate transactions in late January and mid-February, just before the market began to fall, and as government health officials began to issue stark warnings about the effects of the virus, which one can hardly deny would have had effects on the market itself. Feral monkeys have seized the opportunity to run amok at a Thai city following massive human quarantines. Out of Thailand, got some interesting pictures of a Mad Max-esque meets Planet of the Apes type of insurrection, just when it seemed like the world couldn't resemble the opening scenes of an apocalyptic horror film anymore. It appears the coronavirus has sparked gang warfare between monkeys on the streets of Thailand. And you thought you had problems. We've got some video coming out of China depicting what appears to be a complete infrastructure collapse. You can see depicted in the video that buildings are falling down. Winds are wheezing and fires are burning. It's difficult to say where things are going in China given the contradictory reports coming from several different sources. It's hard to say exactly what is being depicted here, but it appears the news is not good. We have a dated 18th of March, full day's super wind has caused electrical leakage, which has led to fires, which continue to rage on. We have additional footage of the 4 remaining cameras in Wuhan, which are still gathering video data, which we'll go to in just a minute once we're done with this show. Always with this type of media, it's difficult to validate, but the news does not appear to be good. People are panicking. Fires are spreading apparently far and wide, and this wind is not going to make things any better. All right, a situation of cars burning. And just really what appears to be the gates of hell themselves opening, but which is probably just a fire. Nevertheless, must be quite unnerving for those citizens there. We hope things will recover for them really quickly and that things will go back to normal. Or perhaps a better version of normal, which does not involve as much animal or environmental cruelty. Here we are depicting the 4 remaining cameras left in Wuhan City. As we can see, there is a bit of car traffic, but hardly any at all. We are looking at basically a ghost town here.
Doesn't keep one.
More bad news coming out of Asia. New avian flu outbreaks have impacted China, India, and the Philippines. On March 19th, from WATAGNet, highly pathogenic avian influenza has returned to the Philippines after an absence of 2 years, as well as other Asian and European countries. In the first week of March 2020, the H5N6 virus variant was detected in a flock of 15,000 quail, around 3,000 of which died. There does not appear to be any end to the calamity, as the locust plague, which those of you who've been following for a while have known that this has been ongoing for at least a month now, has put millions at risk of food insecurity. Forecasters warn, as Saudi Arabia uses field teams to clear 6,550 hectares of the devastating insects. So just to get an idea of what size this is, Manhattan Island is about 5,000 hectares. So they have just cleared an area larger than Manhattan in order to stem the flow of these locusts. Saudi Arabia has deployed its team to limit devastation caused by swarms. Pakistan has seen its entire harvest decimated by the worst plague in 30 years, and UN experts have said that the situation remains extremely alarming. Forecasters have warned that millions are at risk for food insecurity due to a plague of locusts sweeping 9 countries in East Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. The desert locusts, which have reached plague proportions due to 2 cyclones 5 months apart in 2018 and further rain last year, have already munched their way through more than 170,000 hectares of crops in East Africa alone. Pakistan saw its entire harvest decimated by the worst plague in 30 years when the devastating insects hit the country, and Saudi Arabia has deployed field control teams to kill off all locusts in an estimated 6,550 hectares as it attempts to limit damage as dense swarms fly in from India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran on the back of strong winds. We can see here an image of what these bugs look like. not very friendly, highly evolved to their environment as well. All right, here we have a map of the spread. Appears to be moving quite quickly. UN's FAO organization has warned the situation remains extremely alarming in the Horn of Africa, particularly Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Widespread breeding is in progress as new swarms are starting to form. Was said on March 17th, representing an unprecedented threat to food security and livelihoods at the beginning of the upcoming cropping season. They warned of that the locusts are out of control in Kenya, Ethiopia, war-ravaged Yemen, and virus-hit Yemen. Bands of young locusts called hoppers are currently in the first three nations, with hatching imminent in Iran's provinces. Situation is considered under control in Sudan, Eritrea, Egypt, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. Interesting to see where this goes in the near future. Over to market news. Forbes has predicted that the virus outbreak of 2020 will signal the end of China as the global manufacturing hub. This sentiment has also been echoed by the Financial Times. Having a look at this article, new coronavirus COVID-19 will end up being the final curtain on China's nearly 30-year role as the world's leading manufacturer. Using China as a hub, that model died this week, I think, says Vladimir Signorelli, head of Bretton Woods Research, a macro investment research firm. China's economy is getting hit much harder by the coronavirus outbreak than markets currently recognize. Wall Street appeared to be the last to realize this last week when the S&P 500 fell over 8%, the worst performing market of all the big coronavirus infected nations. Even Italy, which has had over 1,000 cases now, did better last week than the US. China on hold. On January 23rd, Beijing ordered the extension of the Lunar New Year holiday, postponing a return to work. Coronavirus was spreading fast in the epicenter province of Hubei, and the last thing China wanted was for that to be repeated elsewhere. Travel restrictions and quarantines of nearly 60 million people drove business activity to a standstill. And the most frightening aspect of the crisis is not the short-term economic damage it is causing, but the potential long-lasting disruption to supply chains. Shaddad H. Quazi, the managing director of logistics companies, have reported higher closure rates than the national average. The ripple effects of this severe disruption will be felt throughout the global auto parts, electronics, and pharmaceutical supply chains for months to come, he wrote. The Financial Times has also reported that fears are rising that U.S.-China economic decoupling is irreversible at this point. This was back in January, but it does not appear that things have gotten any better in recent times. President Trump has been carrying out an ongoing trade war with Russia, though few understand exactly what that means. We'll talk about it a little bit later and get to the heart of what exactly is exacerbating this crisis via the petrodollar and the U.S., key trading partners worldwide, of which China is one. In order to understand what exactly is going on with these markets, let's head on over to zerohedge.com. This is what a $12 trillion margin call looks like. Mystery chart time. All right, so what we are looking at here is the value of the US petrodollar moving in a skyward direction, which would suggest deflation. Zero Hedge indicates this is what happens when a global margin call reveals that there is a 12 trillion short squeeze. This is the biggest 7-day gain for the US dollar since Black Wednesday in 1992, when George Soros broke the Bank of England, crashing the pound and forcing Britain to withdraw from the European exchange rate mechanism. It's also on par with October 1978's surge in the dollar when the Fed clamped down hard on monetary policy after the signing of the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, better known as the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, mandating the Fed to crack down on inflation, sending the stock market into the infamous October massacre. According to JP Morgan's calculations, the global dollar short has doubled since the financial crisis and was 12 trillion as of this moment, some 60% of the US GDP. Events of last week so ominously demonstrated, the dollar shortage is back with a vengeance, as confirmed by last week's concurrent surge in both the Bloomberg Dollar Index and the FRA OIS spread, a closely followed indicator of interbank dollar funding availability. It comes as a shock to some, but ever since the financial crisis, nothing has actually been fixed. And instead, the Fed stepped in at every market stress to inject more liquidity, aiding the issue of even more debt and kicking the can while helping mask the symptoms of the crisis. Now, what exactly is the crisis? Well, we have to understand that we're not dealing with a normal situation here with regards to labor market value. Normally, when things are running in a sane manner, the way that labor informs currency value is that currency value is essentially a shorthand for how productive labor is, combined with what people are willing to pay for. Is your labor worth? And when your labor is higher quality, should be worth more. So there should be a coupling between labor value and relative value of currency because it's backed by something more tangible, i.e. this work ethic / more subtle aspect of, what are people actually willing to pay for. But this is not how things work in the modern day. How do things work in the modern day? Well, we have to take a look at what happened after World War II, which involved instituting US dollar as the global reserve currency, in the sense that you had to pay for crude oil in petrodollars. Now, what did this cause? This caused some sort of perverse coupling between the crude oil price and the US dollar, which, remember, is supposed to be coupled to the average value of labor, but in this case is sort of derailed from that and paired to the value of basically what people are willing to pay for crude oil. What do you notice when you look at these two graphs? There's almost appears to be an inverse connection between these two. When one is going up, the other one's going down. What just happened? Crude oil fell through the floor. Now the US dollar is increasing in value. What exactly does that mean? Well, we have to look at history to see where this has happened before, what the results were, and then we'll get to understand why such actions may have been taken for financial reasons in the first place. Let's go back and have a look at the stock market crash of 1929, which also saw a period of deflation. Even after the Wall Street crash of 1929, optimism persisted for some time. John D. Rockefeller said, "These are days when many are discouraged. In the 93 years of my life, depressions have come and gone. Prosperity has always returned and will again." The stock market turned upward in early 1930, returning to early 1929 levels by April. This was still almost 30% below the peak of September 1929, however. Together, government and business spent more in the first half of 1930 than in the corresponding period of the previous year. On the other hand, consumers, many of whom had suffered severe losses in the stock market the previous year, cut back their expenditures by 10%. In addition, beginning in the mid-1930s, interest rates had dropped to low levels, but expected deflation and the continuing reluctance of people to borrow meant that consumer spending and investment were depressed. By May of 1930, automobile sales had declined below levels of 1928. Prices in general began to decline, although wages held steady in 1930. Then a deflationary spiral started in 1931. Farmers faced a worse outlook, declining crop prices, and a Great Plains drought crippled their economic outlook. At its peak, the Great Depression saw nearly 10% of all Great Plains farms change hands despite federal assistance. The decline in the U.S. economy was the factor that pulled down most of the other countries at first. Then, internal weaknesses or strengths in each country made conditions worse or better. For attempts to shore up the economies of individual nations through protectionist policies, such as the 1930 U.S. Smoot-Hawley Tariffs Act and retaliatory tariffs in other countries, exacerbated the collapse in global trade. By 1933, the economic decline had pushed world trade to 1/3 of its level just 4 years earlier. Apologies for the interruptions. We had a bit of a phone call there where I was notified that someone working in the US with subject matter expertise on forensic genetics is interested in getting the word out because she is passionate, absolutely passionate about countering the suppression of information. So we'll be giving her and her work a platform as soon as possible. Really looking forward to that. Again, apologies for the interruption to the usual. Going back to our usual broadcast, it appears the US dollar is faced like this. Everybody uses oil, so markets come to depend to various extents on oil. But if you're stuck paying for oil in US dollars, well, what that's going to do is artificially increase the value because everything has to go through this filtration system of paying for things in US dollars. As we understand, governments operate with considerable debt burdens, and now they're having trouble paying those debts, which are largely in US dollars due to this merging together of US dollar valuation and petrodollar. It's a bit difficult to understand because we have this counterintuitive, or at first it's counterintuitive, this idea that the crude oil price and the US dollar are varying inversely with each other. And that's counterintuitive because what the dollar value is supposed to be tied to is work ethic, not crude oil, which is something that is actually quite variable, whereas work ethic is really not super variable most of the time. So we have a situation now where Saudi Arabia is basically able to control a significant amount of world markets simply by flooding them with cheap oil. This hasn't changed the fact that foreign governments have to pay for oil in petrodollars, which is causing what appears to be a liquidity crisis for the US dollar itself. In financial economics, a liquidity crisis refers to an acute shortage or drying up of liquidity. Liquidity may refer to market liquidity. In this case, it's a supply of US dollars. Very low supply because people can't make economy when the economy shut down because of quarantine. They can't make money to get taxed, to get converted into US dollars, to pay for the oil. They can't even get the economy going because everybody's holed up in their houses, unfortunately. And so there's no way to get this money to pay the debts. And we are facing a situation of a shortage, basically. Now, what happens when there's a shortage is that it's a supply and demand thing. Supply goes down, people are willing to pay more for it because it is more rare. So in this case, we're looking at liquidity of US dollars themselves, which is why we've seen this pumping quantitative easing of the Fed, which has been personified in this rather hilarious meme that has been making the rounds on Biz as well as 4chan. Continuing on, the forces which bring about a liquidity crisis mutually reinforce each other, or can. Market participants in need of cash find it hard to locate potential trading partners to sell their assets. This may result either due to limited market participation, which is what we're seeing now, or because of a decrease in cash held by financial market participants, which is also happening now due to the loss of valuation of stocks. Thus, asset holders may be forced to sell their assets at a price below the long-term fundamental price. Borrowers typically face higher loan costs and collateral requirements compared to periods of ample liquidity, and unsecured debt is nearly impossible to obtain. Typically, during a liquidity crisis, the interbank lending market does not function smoothly either. Several mechanisms operating through the mutual reinforcement of asset market liquidity and funding liquidity can amplify the effects of a small negative shock to the economy and result in a lack of liquidity and eventually full-blown financial crisis. You can read more about this over on Wikipedia, but it does appear that the US dollar is entering a liquidity crisis. It's worth reminding ourselves of coverage that came out of finance.yahoo.com on March 16th, relating that Morgan Stanley says markets are bottoming, so sell US dollar. Very interesting turn of events there. However, not very surprising. If it's deflating, that means its value is increasing, and maybe this means they expect it to start inflating soon, therefore inferring that this is the maximum value that US dollar will ever have. When you look at it from this angle, it all seems rather contrived, doesn't it? Not everybody is so negative. CCN.com reports, that the Dow is rallying as Warren Buffett buys the stock market dip. Now, this is outdated by a few days. And as of last indication, the main markets are still down in the United States quite a bit. Optimism emerged on Wall Street as the stock market volatility finally dropped. Dow Jones rallied back from 3-year lows as billionaires like Warren Buffett and Carl Icahn started buying the dip. Dow bulls must still endure horrendous economic data over the coming weeks, however. This optimism may prove premature, as Barron's.com, as of 3 hours ago, has reported that the Dow dropped 913 points because stimulus efforts are falling flat. Stocks fell again on Friday to finish another crazy week. Still, the tech-heavy NASDAQ Composite was performing better as investors appear to view growth plays as defensive bids now. And Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 913.21 points, or 4.55%, to close at 19,173.98. Having a lot of losses there, down from over 29,000 less than a month. It makes us wonder whether financial giants Buffett and Icahn know something we don't, or if they are just falling into a familiar trap known as the gambler's fallacy. It is the erroneous belief that if a particular event occurs more frequently than normal during the past, it becomes less likely to happen in the future, or vice versa. It's called a fallacy for a reason. Another important trend to note is the price of markets could easily shed another 30-40% of their values, one analyst said. The biggest shocks will likely come after April 1st, when Saudi Arabia and Russia ramp up their crude production after a previously agreed OPEC Plus deal expired. Last time there was a global surplus of this magnitude was never. Tons of cheap oil and no one to buy it. Well, it's times like these that really show us what is truly important in life. Another interesting impact of the global petrodollar is a decoupling between supply and demand for silver. Physical demand has spiked as prices dropped to an 11-year low. So this is, again, something to do with the petrodollar, because under normal market conditions, as the demand goes up, the price goes up if the supply remains approximately constant. We have not observed this whatsoever, and silver prices have dropped to their lowest level since 2009, boosting demand for the physical metal at a rate not seen in a decade. Supplies of physical silver as well as gold remain well below extremely strong demand, said Dana Samuelson, president of precious metals dealer American Gold Exchange Incorporated. The fall in the underlying gold and silver prices, coupled with the potential recession due to the sharp economic downturn the coronavirus is causing, has spurred the public to buy physical precious metals at the fastest pace in 10 years. In the 3 days since that article was published, gold and silver prices are up a little bit as buyers step back into the markets. April gold futures were up to $22.70 an ounce at 1,500, or they were, up $22.70 an ounce at 1,503. May COMEX silver prices were up $0.481, trading at $12.62 an ounce, much lower than many earlier predictions. Global stock markets were mostly higher in overnight trading. U.S. stock index futures are presently pointed towards solidly higher openings when the New York day session begins, which did not appear to pan out as it took another tumble before the market closed on Friday. Welcome back to the live show. Thank you so much for tuning in. All right, to cover a bit of good news. in the looks like the Bitcoin markets have hit a floor, at least for the time being, back up above 6,000 US dollars. From CNBC News, cryptocurrencies rise 23.8 billion in 24 hours as Bitcoin jumps near 16%. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and XRP prices rallied on Friday. Value of the entire cryptocurrency market rose around 23.8 billion in 24 hours, around 8:42 a.m. Singapore time. The bounce in prices followed two major bouts of violent selling earlier this month. Bitcoin is still trading below where it started in 2020. Very important to note just how volatile these markets truly are. So you can see the total history of Bitcoin is really forging into new territory here. Where things will go in the future is hard to say. Mentioned earlier that there was a debate that appeared to be important but may or may not be important between Stéphane Molyneux and JF Guerrier-P. Let's tune in to see if they're still alive and if they have resolved the problem of whether... Well, I'll let you watch. We'll just... I can't. Oh, it looks like it's over. All right, well, I wonder how that ended up. Let's have a look at the last little bit. See if that's still loaded there. I was interested. I was tuning in for a little bit. They had the common problem that people encounter when they debate without actually...
That...
The issue with debating is that if you're not sharing, whatever your level you're not sharing axioms on, that's where you're going to run into problems. So the good debates, essentially, the way to think about it is almost like a nesting of axioms. Those of you who are familiar with computer programming, what nested algorithms mean, you can sort of have a visual of what that type of layout is. So your outermost sets of brackets, that which encompasses everything that you are going to be talking about, those are your foundational, what you call universal axioms. Excuse me. Now, for myself, I use the causality axiom, which is that effects come in the future of causes. Every effect has a cause or causes, and that there exists a supreme cause. Now, that is something I've had trouble getting people to agree to, but I think ultimately it's the most defensible position for universal axioms. The only way to undermine the causality axiom is to basically take the position that it is not possible to make any statement of fact, at which point you might as well give up on philosophy. So if we can get past that, then you can start to introduce more nested axioms. So axioms which have sort of stitched into them the causality axiom. And that's where you get into stuff like my pseudo-axiom codes that talk about reality through various lenses. And they're true. They're not as true as the prime causality axiom, but they're true within the domain that they seek to make predictions. And then you use inter-domain analysis to see whether your general predictions converge within both base sets of axioms. So that's a big topic. If you can't even get on the same page about sharing axioms, however, you're essentially not going to get off the ground. And that's a little bit what we saw. We can kind of see on these gentlemen's faces. Neither appears to be having that great of a time. Let's have a bit of a listen to see where things ended up. I've just backed it up about 20 minutes before the end here. Let's have a look at where they were at
the
about 20 minutes ago.
Varies enormously over the course of the day. You will probably not be a very effective or efficient engineer. So consistency of theory has a lot to do with practical value of outcome. And so I do talk about how if you have a society that is generally based upon universal and consistent bans on rape, theft, assault, and murder, then the more those societies tend to respect property rights and personal sovereignty and bodily integrity and so on, the more that societies enact principles based upon UPB in general, the the better those societies will become, according to various metrics, which I think we can all say it's better to live on $100 a day than on $1 a day. It's better to have access to healthcare than not to have access to healthcare. It's better to, have relatively comfortable temperatures rather than die of heat or cold every day or whatever. It's better to have some way to store food than to starve to death over the winter. So there's some things that, now this is not proof of UPB, but this is a proof of the value of the effects of UPB. And so, like in the way that if we apply a particular medicine to cure an illness, if the medicine does in fact cure that illness with few, if any, side effects, that's generally better than a medicine which doesn't cure the illness or cures the illness but kills the patient or something like that. So I do talk about how when societies do ban rape, theft, assault, and murder on a more consistent basis, they generally tend to do better. And an example that I've used more recently in my fundamentally murder patients from sort of the, so UPB perfectly of love. In fact, they'll probably just out how you expected in happier they have, and rape kind of an empirical
to me a factual statement.
just across the world, but throughout human history.
Well, my view on this is it could very well be the case that certain moral systems, certain ways of behaving in society lead to more wealth. That would be, to me, a factual statement. It would be subject to science, and we just count the wealth and count the rapes and make correlations. That being said, all I would point out here is that desiring wealthy societies is a moral preference in and of itself, and it stems from subjective considerations. This makes me think about Kyrgyzstan, a country where I've seen a documentary about recently on Vice. It's a documentary from 2012. And in this country, it seems that the majority of marriage are actually acquired by bride kidnapping, essentially a rape, essentially the man going to kidnap his bride by force, bringing her to the family. And within a few hours, it seems that, or within a few days for certain of them, it seems that they acquire a taste for the husband and they end up enduring it.
Anyway, I don't know how much more of that I can really listen to just on account of I've heard Stefan's position, and I'm perhaps a little bit less familiar with JF's position, but from what I understand about Stefan's position is he's basically attempting to come up with some type of framework, some workable framework for instituting what they call the non-aggression principle. And from what I understand about JF's position is he's a moral nihilist, which is basically he's saying that all statements about morality ultimately boil down to aesthetic preferences. Now, I'm not sure if he's used that exact same terminology, but I have an article where I attempt to go into how morality works and how morality is connected to sense data. It's a little bit, it is, I would argue, an aesthetic argument, but it is also an objective argument. So I would be considered both a universal nihilist, but a moral absolutist. So I'll be sharing that for in the chat with anyone who wants to have a read. But basically, you have to pick the right axioms, right? You really have to take a look at the question and start from the answer you're trying. Like, what form do you want your answer to take? If we're going to be making statements about morality, we really want it to be practicable. So I won't go into my proof too much. I'll let people read that at their own leisure. But essentially, Stefan's position is bad stuff is bad. Okay. He did, to his credit, make a fairly interesting argument about if, hypothetically, rape was a good thing, but also rape, okay, here's basically the form of his argument. It's not possible to construct a situation where rape is good, because as soon as rape is good, that means that it's no longer, there's no longer this like implicit sort of badness to rape, and therefore what's happening is no longer satisfying the definition of rape. So what he's an unsolicited power differential, and those things can be said to be undesirable because everyone is essentially seeking to manifest their own will to power, i.e. to impose their own aesthetic preference on the external world so as to minimize the cognitive dissonance that they experience. This is not a statement of moral fact. This is merely a statement of observable fact. Morality comes in where you're trying to answer the question, what's the best outcome for, again, moral statements are always relative to your moral architecture. And this is a problem if we can't even make a statement of fact about what morality is. Well, how are you ever going to test your statements within an ethic or moral framework? So I take a position and say that minimizing of suffering is the greatest morality. And it's just really it then reduces to a question of what exactly is going to minimize the suffering. Obviously, a very complicated question, but it's a question we could start to get answers to on a day-to-day basis simply by looking at situations and how they're dealt with and getting a general sense of how much suffering they cause. I'm not sure if either of these men is actually at this point. So I would say that the biggest problem with Stefan's position is essentially he's not defining the boundary between aggression and non-aggression. For example, at what point does an act become an act of aggression? If what you're looking to do is minimize aggression or non-aggression principle, at what point is it aggression, and which requires you to define something called property, which is basically property crime. Everything essentially reduces to a property crime because an aggression is an aggression on property. And I've asked ANCAPs this before, well, whose property are people's individual minds? Clearly their minds don't belong to themselves because the vast majority of people don't experience inner thought or much inner cognition at all. And so are largely just repeating what other people are saying. Therefore, it does make sense to consider the boundary of these people's very beliefs themselves. At what point are there aggressions on people's individual beliefs? They cannot answer that. They just brush it off by saying, well, everyone can just go and find whatever is the best information and make the best decision for them. It's like, no, you're not really taking into account the fact that people are basically automatons in your whole equation. So clearly there has to be moral guidance. You need to have some way to manufacture benevolence, because benevolence is what is going to engender the faith in the populace to continue to subscribe to the state theology. Stefan has basically wallpapered over this problem in the way so many people wallpaper over problems. God did it. It was just a random occurrence. We've got missing links in the evolutionary chain. It's really just laziness, essentially. So he's basically, his wallpaper is, okay, let's have a DRO, a dispute resolution organization, a mediation carried out between two people who disagree as to the boundary of their property, at which point a violation would have occurred. So basically they're disagreeing as to whether a violation has occurred or not. And if there has been a violation of the non-aggression principle, gosh, this is a wordy system. If there has been a violation, what is the proper restitution? So again, that's a very complicated problem. You need some moral standard by which to judge these things, right? How do you know exactly if you're not actually taking the time to define the boundary between what is aggression and non-aggression for people's personal beliefs and autonomy, which absolutely needs to be defined because people's beliefs dictate their behavior. All right. So you're basically wallpapering over a very important point. How do you manufacture benevolence given the subjectivity of morality? How do you manufacture sufficient benevolence as to give sufficient vision to answer these dispute resolution organization problems? / how do you stop the usual suspects from coming in with their financial incentives that serve as bribes to preside over these mediations, which if there's bribes in the mix, if there's a possibility for these DRO agents to be bribed, well, they will be bribed. And the more they're bribed, the more the resources will shift towards the bribers, which will enable the bribers to bribe more. So how do you solve that? Now you're also going to take the position that free markets are a good thing. Okay, well, if you can't have free markets and DROs that are actually efficient at the same time, that makes no sense. Ultimately, one will has to trump the other. This is why you need a hierarchy of authority. You need to have distributed dictatorship, whereby sovereign decisions are delegated to the lowest possible level of competence, depending on the field. Now, that's going to depend largely on the field, right? If two people are arguing about an apple because it fell from one person's tree into another person's yard, well, that's a very simple resolution, right? Versus what to do about these chemical toxins that are leaking into the environment that may be having long-term effects. Well, that's a significantly more difficult question, right? So it doesn't make sense for a local chieftain to be making such broad decisions in a subject matter he doesn't understand, but it also doesn't make sense for a subject matter expert to be brought in on an apple dispute. So the idea with the distributed dictatorship is that the individual or the local sovereign has enough autonomy to know what are the questions that he or she is equipped to answer, and what has to be delegated up the chain. This is why the sovereign will is so important in proper statecraft, because it's all down to whether the people who have been delegated sovereign will by the people that they're governing to make difficult decisions that the people themselves can't resolve amongst themselves. It's down to how well they manage their own subject matter experts. And there will be certain things that will come up that will be simply outside of their domain, and it rests on them to know the difference. That's where it's so very important. And you also need to have a supreme sovereign who's going to oversee the development of the prolonged development of culture, because culture doesn't just self-create. It has to be guided by, again, some type of moral framework, someone who's accorded a moral superiority stance based on their actions and their character to guide more or less the direction of civilization. This is where where the importance of role models is really quite evident. All right, I've got some clips for people if they're interested in watching of people who have long annoyed me. The spandex pants yoga sluts. I was while I was hunting for all this news and all the hottest websites and so forth for you, I was notified of an update of one of the channels I've subscribed to. And I remember I found this channel originally through Alex Jones, and it seemed, quasi-interesting material about psychology and, stretching yoga stuff. And I noticed they put out a video, and the girl was, not looking so composed and calm. Certainly not what we would expect from a seasoned yogi who could never get upset over pretty much anything that was ever going on, right? So then I was like, hey, why don't I go and YouTube and search up yoga vlog? And from that, I managed to find a pretty interesting set of clips, which I will now play for you. Hope you enjoy.
Blows over really quick, and we're able to just go back to things as usual as soon as possible. But unfortunately, normally I have a person moderating, like sitting in the next room, and it's just not workable right now. Sean Aylward, it's safe to say you're the most relaxed person on the planet, correct? I don't know. That's an interesting question. Not at the moment.
He's just setting up his bike to have a little Swift sesh. Don't worry, I won't pan around because he's bending over in his pants. I'm just going to get up and have a shower and then crack on with some video editing. As you may have noticed, I haven't had any yoga videos go up for a few days, and I just really needed the yoga videos go up for a few days, and I just really needed the break. And I had a bit of a meltdown the other day, particularly like with coronavirus and stuff. Today I'm just teaching one corporate class, maybe. I'm going to see if they still want to. I've emailed them just to check, like, with all this going on, like if they still even want a yoga class. So waiting for
positive comments, not negative comments. I'm just gonna delete them. That's not what this is for. I know I deal with stress and anxiety, and these past few days they definitely skyrocketed. Last night I just was sitting in bed, I could feel my heart rate, I felt anxious, I was looking at stuff on social media, and I was just really nervous. And I'm hoping to do these videos just for support, so that we can support each other, talk to each other, things that help. Like, one thing I was going to ask you guys is ideas for kids to do at home. I'm definitely not a DIY like kind of person where I come up with these creative ideas. I'm not that kind of person. So
taking a bit of a break from work to give you a general sense of what my family has stocked up for the coronavirus. We have tissue papers, but I'm not too worried about this. Apparently, it's...
This is, oh my god, that sound is really good. Hello world, this is day 2 of our quarantine. Say good morning, Carter.
Hi.
It is almost 9:30 at our time right now. We had breakfast, it was really nice, and we're about to do yoga. Now, this channel, Yogi Melbourne,
Yogini?
Yogan Melbourne? YOG...
Yogurt Melbourne.
Oh, it's...
Yogini.
YOG...
Oye, yo creo que no lo puedo hacer así. Que va muy rápido.
Ya, pero no lo mires, tú hazlo a tu ritmo.
All right. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed making it. Back to our friends here, see if they said anything even remotely coherent in the last... Let's just see how much more time there was here. My gosh. I've already got some feedback from King Kush saying that the debate was a total waste of time. I mean, when you've mentioned the word quantum mechanics 20 times in 5 minutes, you're clearly... The point's just not being made. Like, let's see where things... Dear God.
Intellectually, I don't even know what's going on, but I'm just kind of curious. It's the same question I had for the communists. Like, if you have a moral theory that puts you on the same level as a rapist or a child rapist, does that give you any pause about the theory? Does that make you think that maybe you've made a mistake somewhere?
No, to the contrary, I think it empowers you with an understanding that whatever equilibrium we've reached as human society is very fragile, and it could have gone other way, and it could go other way in the future. And it gives you a kind of moral, I would say, an attitude against moral imperialism, and an understanding that ultimately I'm that way, but I could have been another way. And it actually removes a will to act in certain situations. For example, respecting others when they choose to use drugs, or not acting when they choose to do self-harm. It simply gives you the power to understand that society could have gone another way, could have been much more violent, and that the particular moralities that we have, they could go away eventually if they were selected out of us.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So I did see a video that someone sent to me. We don't have to get into the details.
I don't really think JF did as well as he has in previous debates. I think this one caught him a bit off guard, and he wasn't quite prepared enough or familiar enough with what it was that Stefan was saying, or able to debate under Stefan's pseudo-axiom code. But I do ultimately think that JF's position, as much as I don't prefer it, is more defensible than Stefan's here. He's essentially saying he's agnostic towards morality, which is a perfectly defensible position. If you don't want to spend your time contemplating questions of morality, don't go as far as to deny that morality is a thing. And clearly it is. It's as clear to me as the fact that we're sense-oriented creatures. Clearly morality is something that is intrinsically dictated by our senses. But yeah, that's an interesting one. I had a piece of news here that I thought would be interesting to cover in a scientific context. Humans are hardwired to dismiss facts that don't fit their worldview. So it's probably sounding really familiar. This is on January 31st of this year, and they're talking about something being rotten in the state of American political life. U.S., among other nations, is increasingly characterized by highly polarized, informationally insulated ideological communities occupying their own factual universe as well. Gee golly gosh, this sure sounds familiar, don't it? We are almost speaking different languages at this point, I would say. So definitely important to take that into consideration. So, yeah, ultimately, just to come back to this debate real quick, ultimately, they're both taking a rather weak position because they don't actually answer all the questions they're purporting to ask. They're saying, well, it's someone else's job. Okay, well, if it's someone else's job and it's not your job, whose job is it? Like, can you just at least agree on someone? I guess, in my view, JF's morality, though defensible, falls short of striving for the supreme ideal, though he has counter-signaled this genetic meddling that coronavirus outbreak hopefully teaches us once and for all is something that should be severely curtailed. So his position is basically due to this phenotypic revolution between RNA and DNA, therefore we shouldn't give the potential for computers to start to dictate the course of our genetic evolution. I think that's a pretty weak argument given this phenotypic revolution. If it even happened, which I doubt that it did, would have taken place 4 billion years ago. Though not very likely that it's going to happen again. It looks like life has more or less settled in a permanent, DNA-based mode. So I've got a video here that I think makes a stronger argument against genetic manipulation than either JF or Stefan could make through either of their systems because it involves a theocratic angle as well as metaphors for teaching. And if you want the background on this, look up the Mahabharata, also known as the story of Krishna here. The one the Hare Krishnas are always talking about, the Bhagavad Gita, right? So this is a sort of a side story in the Bhagavad Gita about the army that Krishna and Arjun were fighting against. I think this actually makes a stronger argument because it sort of speaks to people subjectively, which comes back to some points we were arguing on the Week in Review earlier about how subjective bases can actually yield more information than their objective counterparts.
Mightiest of kings, what you ask me to do next can never be undone. Do you understand?
Yes. Can you save him?
What price are you willing to pay?
Anything.
Then give me your sword, great king.
For what purpose?
Give me your sword willingly, and with no hesitation.
Drith, please stop this. There must be another way.
You know what's at stake.
What have you done?
From one, let there be 100.
It's been days, my king. Why do you torture yourself? There's nothing more than pieces of death in each of these jars.
Death is the fertile ground from which all life springs. I will stay for as long as it takes.
Bhishma, please, tell me what you see.
It's a boy, my king. The boy of your dreams. Black hair. Dark eyes. Olive skin. He's flawless, King Drith.
I have waited so long for this. For you, my little peacock. The wolf had tried, but he could not stop you then. And he will not stop you when the time comes. You have the will of a king. You shall be named Duryodhana, the unconquerable one. Tell me what you see.
I see the future, King Drith. I see the future.
Things are heating up. Let's have a listen over at Tucker Carlson on the current situation with China.
Attention to the stranglehold on global medicine production that China has. That country doesn't just make many of the world's drugs. For the drugs they don't make, they often make the relevant ingredients. Just how profound is China's dominance of this sector? Well, we found the definitive expert on that question. Rosemary Gibson is a senior advisor at the Hastings Institute and the author of the book China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine. She joins us tonight. Thanks so much, Rosemary Gibson, for coming on. So we've been focused a lot on antibiotics. China makes 97% of the ones that we use. But broaden it out a little bit for us. Just how dependent are we for medicine on China?
Tucker, China makes thousands of the ingredients for our generic drugs. Even the medicines to care for people who are hospitalized with coronavirus, 90% of those ingredients come from China. We're talking about basic medicines to take care of people who have infections, who have to be on ventilators. And by the way, Tucker, the story about ventilators, here's why we have a shortage of ventilators in the United States. China stopped shipping the circuit boards to make them. So we have to bring our production back home of medicines and all of our medical supplies. I was at a hospital a couple weeks ago talking about antibiotics, and they said there are some antibiotics they just can't get, and others they're rationing. We are rationing antibiotics in the United States of America because we have lost our industrial base. And we lost our industrial base because China cheated. And American companies have to compete with the Chinese government, not Chinese companies, because those companies are subsidized by their government. How can American companies win against that?
So a lot of finger pointing, very few solutions forthcoming from these spit-shine turds, but what else can we expect? That's what they're paid to do. Sound good, look good, not exactly paid to know stuff. Speaking of turds, let's have a look at an interesting story coming out of Tinder.
Oh my god, Louis invited a girl over and she took our fucking toilet paper. Oh my god. Holy shit.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this man thought he was going to be getting easy hookup sex, but is actually being faced with a very real reality.
Oh my god. Where'd you meet her?
Looming toilet paper shortages.
I can't fucking believe that. Oh my goodness. That is fucking funny.
It's Arnab Goswami that I have previously stated was the Indian version of Tucker Carlson. Looks like my bit or my line has been picked up by none other than John Oliver himself.
But for now, let's move on to a quick update on India, or as people with this accent have historically called it, mine. A couple of weeks ago, we did a story about India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which some die-hard Modi supporters like Arnab Goswami, the Tucker Carlson of India, did not enjoy. Now, the first hint I got that he was not happy with me was in a promo for his upcoming show.
Go look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself whether you're a motivated fool, consciously or unconsciously a fool, or whether you are just malicious.
Now, I don't know if you noticed there, but when he said, look in the mirror, this is what was in the mirror. And look, that might not be me. It might not be me. That could be Steve Mnuchin, or Milhouse from The Simpsons, or this one owl, you know, any number of hotties. But in case you were thinking that it could have been someone else, I'm afraid his show cleared any confusion up.
An ignoramus of exceedingly global proportions, Sushant Sareen. A man whose only job is as a comedian. He's not even smart enough to be a satirist. A person with absolutely no knowledge, and who I'm told even has his good morning and good evening written out to him by his team of researchers. A British-American late-night, third-rate TV host. John Oliver, you embarrass yourself.
Listen. I'll give you ignorance. I'll even give you third-rate TV host. My researchers assure me that's actually a compliment. But I embarrassed myself? Who the fuck do you think you're talking to? I used HBO's money to purchase and wear jeans designed to give me a sweet peach on television. And not only did I publicly release this photo to the world, I put it on billboards to promote this show. That's in Times Square right now. I am beyond the capacity for shame. You can't hurt me. Now, the interesting thing about him scolding me about our Modi show is that episode didn't actually air in India. A lot of our viewers over there alerted us to the fact that Hotstar, the streaming service that broadcasts us in India, never uploaded that episode. Now, there is no evidence that the Indian government made them do that. As best we can tell, Hotstar just decided to self-censor, which is still not good.